big stories. U.S. President Joe Biden hits China for unfair economic practices in his State of the Union address. In Beijing, Chinese President Xi Jinping tells the armed forces to prepare for conflict at sea.
Former President Duterte has been appointed administrator of the properties of his friend, Pastor Apollo Kiboy, following a U.S. court ruling on sealing warrants against the Kingdom of Jesus Christ leader.
And in just a bit, we will be joined by human rights lawyer, Attorney Chel Diokno, right here in the studio to discuss his plans for 2025, the current state of human rights in the country, and yes, his growing popularity on TikTok.
Welcome to the show. I'm Regina.
I'm Gretchen.
And I'm Shawn.
It is a very pink day, as you guys can see, because after all, it is International Women's Day. The first
Happy
time
International Women's Day.
International Women's Day. It's the first time we've coordinated.
I know.
I
know.
It looks
It's
nice,
Friday,
actually.
but we're wearing
para
pink.
tayong Barbies. But it's a significant day, of course. On to the top stories now. U.S. President Joe Biden had some tough words for China at his last State of the Union address before November's presidential elections. For starters, he criticized China's unfair economic policies and said he's done a better job standing up to Beijing than his predecessor.
And we're standing up against China's unfair economic practices. We're standing up for peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. I've revitalized our partnership and alliance in the Pacific. India, Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Pacific Islands. I've made sure that the most advanced American technologies can't be used in China, not allowing to trade them there. Frankly, for all this tough talk on China, it never occurred to my predecessor to do any of that. I want competition with China, not conflict. And we're in a stronger position to win the conflict of the 21st century against China than anyone else, for that matter, than any time as well.
The U.S. president made no mention of maritime tensions in the West-Philippine Sea nor the Philippines. In fact, the bit about China made up just a small part of his speech, which various U.S. media described as forceful, fiery, and defiant, as he made a case for a second term. After all, there have been persistent questions about his age and fitness for office, something the 81-year-old even joked about.
I know it may not look like it, but I've been around a while. When you get to be my age, certain things become clearer than ever.
Biden spent the bulk of the 68-minute speech tackling domestic issues around taxes, healthcare, immigration, abortion, and the economy. On international affairs, one of the big takeaways was his announcement that the U.S. will build a temporary pier in Gaza to create another route for aid.
The United States has been leading international efforts to get more humanitarian assistance to Gaza. I'm directing the U.S. military to lead an emergency mission to establish a temporary pier in the Mediterranean on the coast of Gaza that can receive large shipments carrying food, water, medicine, and temporary shelters. No U.S. boots will be on the ground. A temporary pier will enable a massive increase in the amount of humanitarian assistance getting into Gaza every day.
Hindi lang pala yung Pilipinas, yung hindi minention ni Biden. He also did not verbally say verbatim, Trump. But he, of course, media always count the number of times that he referred to his predecessor, and that number is 13 times.
13 times.
Well,
we all know who he's referring to.
Yeah.
Sino pa ba?
Sino pa ba?
And ang kanyang main opponent for the elections, of course, looking ahead. But there's been a lot of criticism, of course, related to his age. If he still has the vibrancy and enough energy to go for another, presidency.
Yeah.
And of course, add to that, I think it's not popular with America and the rest of the democratic world, his support for Israel and yung gulo nila with Hamas. This is even after Netanyahu stepped up their military offensive, and the death toll in Gaza, by some estimates, now in the tens of thousands, some saying past 30,000.
Biden's China comments, even though it was just a small part of his speech, comes just a day after Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also escalated his verbal attacks on the U.S. So that's something to note there. This happened on the sidelines of their annual National People's Congress, which is China's highest legislative body, where Wang accused Washington of trying to suppress China. He also said, "We will legitimately defend our rights in accordance with the law." And certain countries outside the region should not stir up trouble or pick sides and not become disruptors or troublemakers in the South China Sea. Once again, we kind of know who he's referring to there.
Okay,
Well,
but
one person who's not backing down is referring back to the Philippines. Our very own spokesperson of the Philippine Coast Guard, Commodore J. Tariela, who has engaged in a word war on X with the Global Times, a nationalist Chinese tabloid. I've been seeing this.
Yes, I have been seeing it as well. I've been getting served.
Oh, they've been reposting and trolling each other. And in his last post, Tariela says, "It appears you are so afraid of us speaking the truth that you always choose to insist it. If it weren't for China's bullying behavior, provocative actions, and illegal presence, there will be no chaos in the South China Sea." And of course, one of the frontiers of the war against, not war, but in the fight
Conflict.
in the West Philippine Sea is online. I mean, the war on truth, the
Yeah.
war on facts, on who is doing what exactly.
I think any sort of war right now, whether it be personal, you hate your classmate, you hate your friend, your ex-boyfriend, or something serious as this, all these fights are now online. And
what's
disinformation.
funny, I know it's a really serious issue, but
It
what's
is.
funny about what's going on between Commodore Tariela and the
the
Global
Global
Times is they
Times.
would copy-paste each other and then just change certain words, right, to lash out at the other side. So medyo funny siya, although it's, granted, it's a very serious matter.
But it's good that somebody's correcting the facts, right? Like, this is the other perspective. If you say this is our take on it, and it's easily accessible if you just click on
If you
the
click on
tweet,
the
Everyone
right?
can see. That's right. That's right.
Well, suffice it to say, the rhetoric at the ongoing National People's Congress in Beijing is also rather fiery. And Reuters reports that President Xi Jinping has called on their armed forces to prepare for conflict at sea. We have Camille Samonte to give us the rest of that story. Go ahead, Camille.
Shawn, it looks like China is trying to cover all fronts from military and maritime defense to matters of economy. We have Reuters reporting that Chinese President Xi Jinping has laid down orders for its armed forces to prepare for military conflicts at sea and protect their maritime rights and interests. Reuters said Xi was also quoted as saying it was necessary to build cyberspace defense system and improve the ability to maintain national network security. We're still waiting for more details on what these preparations would look like, what prompted the Chinese leader to issue such order, and if it is in any way connected to the recent maritime encounters we've had over the past year. Before these, though, there's already been plans to increase China's defense budget, which is already the second highest in the world next to the United States.
全面加强
We should strengthen all-around military training and combat readiness so as to firmly safeguard China's national sovereignty, security, and development interests. We will advance military development as outlined in the 14th Five-Year Plan and speed up the implementation of major national defense projects.
Aside from this, China is also striving to modernize its industrial system and develop new quality productive forces at a faster pace.
We will work to upgrade industrial and supply chains, make traditional industries higher end, smarter, and more eco-friendly. We will actively foster emerging industries and future-oriented industries. We will promote innovative development of the digital economy, fully integrating digital technology into the real economy. We will launch an AI Plus initiative, work to digitalize the manufacturing sector, and vigorously promote the development, openness, distribution, and utilizations of data.
Shawn, with all these targets from the National People's Congress this year, it's safe to say China is making quite a statement in its bid to remain a global power. Shawn?
Thanks so much for all of that, Camille Samonte.
Lots of complex issues. Let's dive into this. Our first guest tonight is Greg Poling. He's a senior fellow and director of the Southeast Asia Program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Good evening, Greg, or should I say good morning? Are you coming to us from the U.S.?
I am, yeah. It's about 7 a.m. here in Washington. So yours is the first coverage I've seen of the State of the Union.
Fantastic. Thanks for getting up early for us. let's focus on the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea issue first. The frequency and intensity of these confrontations have definitely increased. It feels like we are reporting on one nearly every week. Where do you think this is coming from? Is Beijing becoming more aggressive, or are we just getting better at documenting and reporting about these incidents?
A little of each. So my team at AMTI released a report about a month or so ago now, showing that the monthly run-ins around the Ayungin Shoal have been happening since spring 2022. So it didn't just begin last year under the Marcos government, but the number of Chinese vessels and the kinds of tactics they're using have clearly gotten more provocative and more coercive, as we saw with the shattering of the windshield and the ramming of the vessel with Admiral Carlos just last week. But also, the Marcos government has gotten much better at talking about this and imposing diplomatic cost on Beijing for its bad behavior.
All right, as we know, of course, National People's Congress in China, they have their big annual meeting this week. And I believe this is the first time that President Xi Jinping actually called on their armed forces to prepare for conflict at sea, to defend their maritime rights in the South China Sea. How do we take this very specific, statement from the Chinese president?
I wouldn't overreact. Xi Jinping's very first speech when he ascended to leadership on the China Dream in 2013 had a huge component about China's emergence as a maritime power. So this has been a long-standing policy of the People's Liberation Army overall, and Xi in particular. I think the more important trend has been China's abject failures at sea, whether it's around Ayungin Shoal or Bajo de Masinloc this year, or even on oil and gas fields where Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia continue to operate despite the China Coast Guard. All of this gray zone pressure that we've become accustomed to has really stopped paying any dividends for China for about the last year and a half to 2 years.
It's not just the Philippines that is upping its budget on defense, it's also China. We've actually referenced your work in some of the reports that we did, citing the movement in the West Philippine Sea. What trends have you noticed from your end that you can share with us? Movements in terms of fleet, in terms of the number of maritime militia vessels?
Strategy overall?
So I don't think we've seen much change in strategy, which is part of China's problem. It has this playbook of so-called gray zone, non-military coercion, the intentional creation of the risk of collisions, the use of lasers and water cannons and all of that. But still the standing orders for the People's Liberation Army and the Coast Guard are not to use military force, because China recognizes that doing that, especially doing that on camera in the case of the Philippines, would undermine China's entire global ambition to leadership. So they're stuck just putting more and more vessels every year into this same failing strategy. This past year, we saw about a 30% increase in the number of militia vessels every day on the average day in the West Philippine Sea. The China Coast Guard continues to patrol daily at the exact same spots that they've been patrolling for the last 6 years or so, but none of it is producing any change that China wants to see.
That's right. So that leads me to this, Greg. We always talk about how things seem to have hit an impasse already, like what you said. Sometimes we joke about the number of diplomatic protests we have lodged. The number keeps increasing. But, there seems to be everyone's hands are tied. Nobody wants to cast the first stone. Is it time for a change in strategy? And if so, is there really much more, room to navigate in terms of that, in terms of changing tack?
I think there has been a change in strategy. It started in the last year or two of the Duterte administration, and it's accelerated under President Marcos and been embraced by President Biden on the U.S. side. The short-term component of that is deepening the US-Philippine alliance and the Philippines deepening security relationships with Australia and Japan, all of which enhances deterrence and helps explain why the Chinese are so hesitant to use force. The other component is the long-term game of imposing diplomatic and reputational cost. And what we've seen is the Philippines tripled the number of countries who have publicly called for China to comply with the arbitral award last year. China faces more and more international scrutiny and condemnation. And in the meantime, the Philippines is free to continue to resupply and repair the Sierra Madre and has begun re-patrolling around Bajo de Masinloc for the first time in 12 years. So I see the Philippines as having gained ground and China having gotten nothing.
And yet, referring to the State of the Union, which you mentioned earlier, there was no mention of the Philippines in President Joe Biden's address. As a defense ally, how should we read into this? Is the president now divided because of the elections that are coming?
Or perhaps he's
Could we
playing
expect,
safe,
could we
not
expect
mentioning.
support if the Mutual Defense Treaty is triggered? I mean, how is it from your end?
So the two U.S. presidents and at least 4 successive U.S. cabinet secretaries at every opportunity have reiterated that Articles 4 and 5 of the Mutual Defense Treaty apply to the West Philippine Sea. And we've seen all of these new structures to deepen our alliance since the end of 2021. I have almost no doubt that both the U.S. and the Philippines understand how we would implement the treaty, and that it clearly applies in the case of Chinese aggression. I wouldn't read too much into the State of the Union. This is a speech meant for sound bites to be used for the domestic media here in the U.S. It's not a speech about foreign policy.
But actually, President Marcos himself has said that it's not time to invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty. And I think a lot of people here have a very simplistic understanding of what it entails. And they think, oh, shouldn't we be able to call on the U.S. in cases like this, right? What's it for if we're not able to trigger it at a time like this? Help us understand the big and very real implications of activating this treaty.
Yeah, I mean, Article 4 says an attack on either party is to be seen as an attack on both, and we have to coordinate then to meet that common danger. Well, if an attack is what happened early this week with the shattering of the windshield on the Unai and the injury of 4 sailors, do people want that to be the trigger for a wider war? I would think not. Of course not. And so the threat of intervention under the NDT is what prevents China from just escalating military force. In the meantime, the Philippine Coast Guard and the Navy and BFAR are doing an admirable job. They are winning every single day. China has blocked, or tried to block, every resupply mission to Iron Control for almost 2 years now. And every single mission has gotten through. That's a success. And most of them have gotten through with a US P-8 circling overhead to let the Chinese know that if they did escalate to force, the Americans are there to stand by our ally.
All right, Greg, one quick
Sorry,
question. Yeah.
can I just ask a quick follow-up? Who gets to define what an armed attack is? Does it
The
have to-
lawyers in the DFA probably, but
Okay.
I mean, I think an armed attack is kind of, we know it when we see it. We also, for all this gray zone stuff, we also set up the Bantay Dagat framework, the new maritime security dialogue that takes place within the alliance to figure out how do we deal with this gray zone stuff without having to escalate to military force, because that's where we can win this.
Right. Greg, what I wanted to ask you was one thing that has always been plaguing us here in the Philippines, the change of administration there in the United States. If the Republicans win, can the Philippines expect continuity in terms of support for the Mutual Defense Treaty, etc.?
Yes. Remember, it was Secretary Mike Pompeo under a Trump administration that stood on that tarmac in 2019 and pledged that the Mutual Defense Treaty applies to the West Philippine Sea. And then that's been repeated by both Republicans and Democrats. I take some comfort from the fact that we've set up all of these new meetings, all of these new structures within the alliance, all of which were laid out in that joint vision statement for 21st Century Alliance at the end of 2021 and have been reinforced, including during President Marcos's visit to Washington last spring.
Greg, we've talked about the presence of Chinese vessels. Let's talk about our own fleet. In the past months, we've seen Philippine Coast Guard vessels being at the forefront, and now we're seeing Philippine Navy ships patrolling nearer. Is it just, recently that this has happened, or have you seen it on your radar that Philippine Navy vessels are always around resupply missions? And just give us some clarity on what it's like every time a resupply mission happens.
So it's always been Philippine Coast Guard or BFAR supporting contracted civilian ships. The Philippines has been very careful about that for many years. It doesn't want to be the one to be seen to militarize this. But over the last year, we've seen China deploying not just more Coast Guard and more militia, but also deploying more of their PLA Navy ships closer to Ayungin Shoal during these resupply missions, presumably as a threat. They stay back, but they threaten intervention. And so it's reasonable that the Philippine Navy has begun to deploy its vessels more and more often, just over the horizon in the same way, to let China know that the Philippines isn't threatened. And this same reason that you always have now a US P-8 overhead and a US Navy ship way back in port somewhere in the Philippines to also let China know that the US is capable of intervening as well.
What did you make of the heated exchange of words, both on the official and unofficial channels? By official, I mean the communiques between the foreign ministries on both sides, which are, getting more fiery, and also unofficially on Twitter or X. We were just talking about how Commodore J. Tariela is engaged in a word war with the Global Times, which is a nationalist Chinese publication. What do we make of all of this? Are we at breaking point, or this is just noise?
No, this is noise. I mean, look, I'm not really sure who those tweets from the Global Times are meant for. I think Commodore Tariela is going to get the better of it since Twitter is banned within mainland China, and that's their only sympathetic audience. I don't think there's a lot of Filipinos or Americans or other Southeast Asians who are going to be, convinced by these, pretty kind of lackluster attempts at trolling online from the Global Times.
You don't think they've put in any effort into it? I thought it was.
I mean, I don't know what intern at GT thinks that they're making their career with these, but they're not the most sophisticated bit of fire on the internet.
Yeah.
Point taken.
And then lastly, Greg, Shawn was just pointing out that there's been a bit of debate about the diplomatic protests. We've counted 10 this year alone and 143 under President Marcos. And the question there seems to be, are these even still working? Do they even serve a larger purpose?
I think they serve a larger purpose, but if they were the only response, I think people have a right to be frustrated, as they were the only response, remember, in the early years of the Duterte administration. But, the real response is what the Coast Guard, BFAR, and the Navy are doing, what the US, Japan, Australia are doing in coordination with the Philippines. What these diplomatic protests do is they establish a record. And guess what? If the Philippines files a second arbitration case this year, you're going to see all of those protests make their way into the annexes to prove that at no point in time has the Philippines ever accepted any of these Chinese claims. So having that legal record, that diplomatic record, is valuable. It's just not going to change anything tomorrow.
This is a paper trail, valuable
Yeah,
paper trail.
that's true. Very good
That
points
will
right there.
come in handy one day.
We're going to have to leave that there, but thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for getting up so early for us. Greg Poling, Director of the Southeast Asia Program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at CSIS, coming to us live from the U.S.
Up next, Senator Bato de la Rosa tries to question the allegations of rape and abuse against Pastor Apollo Quiboloy. More details when we return.
Welcome back. You're still watching The Big Story here on One News. Another big story, more Filipinos out of work in January, dovetailing with the end of the holiday rush. Data from the PSA shows that over 2 million Filipinos, or 4.5%, were unemployed in January, higher than the 1.6 million recorded in December. But again, that is a seasonal dip. Meanwhile, the number of those who are underemployed or workers who are still looking for extra jobs or extra work hours has climbed to 4.6 million. That is almost 14% of the country's working population. Among the sectors that saw the largest drop in employment are retail sales like groceries, eateries, or sari-sari stores. The PSA attributes this to the end of the holiday season. But apart from that, the PSA is also noting that many women and young workers have stopped looking for new jobs or sources of income after the holidays.
Part of this, sinasabi nila, household duties and schooling. October, alam natin, yung last quarter kasi, di ba marami tayong mga economic activities na dagdag, particularly on retail trade. So, tumutulong yung mga kasama sa bahay doon sa mga negosyo, yung mga stores, karinderya, and yung mga nakikita nating mga bazaar, no? January, nawala na yung mga activities na ito, some of them, kaya nag-off na sila from the labor force and went back doon sa either schooling or to help doon sa mga household duties.
It makes sense. After the holiday rush, matumal na talaga yung bentahan dahil bankrupt na tayo lahat. Biro lang, ako lang yata. But yeah, we kind of don't want to spend because magsa-start na ulit yung mga school, all these payments, and all the due bills in January.
Pero sabi nga ni NEDA Secretary Arsenio Balisacan, we will remain responsive to the needs of vulnerable groups, including women, youth, older individuals, and those with disability. So asahan natin yan. International Women's Day pa naman ngayon.
That's true.
Meanwhile, in other news, a very, very hot topic as well these days, Senator Bato de la Rosa is doubting the allegations of rape and abuse leveled at Apollo Quiboloy. Though he is not a member of the Senate Committee on Women and Children, De La Rosa said he felt forced to speak up about the matter. He thinks there's political agenda behind the hearings.
Sige nga, mag-isip kayo. Anong in aid of legislation na pwede nating makukuha dyan? Anong in aid of legislation na makukuha natin dyan sa pag-imbestiga niya kung nakapile ang kaso?
De La Rosa believes the Senate probe is unnecessary since cases have already been filed by the Justice Department against the pastor. Recall that on Tuesday, the DOJ ordered the filing of charges of sexual abuse and qualified human trafficking against Kiboy. Ultimately, De La Rosa believes that the accusations are false, arguing that Kiboy is a son of God.
If you ask my opinion about him, he is highly respected. Ako mismo, humahanga sa kanya. He is the son of God. Least expected ko sa kanya na gumawa ng ganong offense. Opinion ko lang yan. Hindi ko naman siya nakikita 24 hours a day.
Oh, we're
To be fair, to be fair to everybody, may point naman si Senator De La Rosa na cases have already been filed by the DOJ. Pero let's not forget gaano ka-recent lang yun. That was like days ago.
Yes.
Diba? So talagang umaalmangan lahat ng tao na parang bakit di nga kasuhan dito, ayan na nakasuhan na. Also, I'm not shocked that Senator
So we are
Bato de la
still
Rosa
trying to get the side of Senator Ontiveros, of course. She's the one who's chairing the Senate Committee on Women and Children. And for now, as we discussed yesterday, there are 4 signatures on the document objecting to the contempt order against Kiboy. That's Robin Padilla, Senator Robin Padilla, who started the petition, Bongo, Amy Marcos, Cynthia Villar.
And as we discussed yesterday, there was a 5th signature that was rescinded. That was Senator J.V. Ejercito, who withdrew his signature. Here's his explanation.
So, wala namang masama doon kung i-correct mo yung sarili mo, kung magbago ka ng decision. We are all human. And public perception is secondary. What is important is doing the right thing, di ba? Pero naisip natin, there are certain factors. So, I did not withdraw because of bashing. Sanay na ako dyan. It's a matter of doing the right thing.
Mukhang galing lang sa pagbibisikleta, pagmamotor to si Senator JV, ano? Pero totoo naman, sabi naman niya, Pa nagkamali, palitan ng desisyon.
Palitan. At least binawi niya, di ba, kaysa hindi. At sabi naman ni Senator Robin Padilla, nire-respeto naman daw niya yung desisyon ni Senator J.V. Ejercito.
In terms of the extradition request, supposedly, because the U.S. judge unsealed the arrest warrants against Quiboloy, sabi ng DOJ, they haven't gotten any extradition request. Here's what DOJ spokesperson Nico Clavanes said. There's no extradition request yet by the DOJ from the DFA. It's difficult, however, to speak on hypothetical situations. The government's goal is to attain justice in whatever form and through the best forum.
Now, following that unsealing of warrants against Pastor Quiboloy, former President Rodrigo Duterte has been designated as the new administrator of the pastor's properties. Former Presidential Legal Counsel Attorney Sal Panelo clarifies, though, that the former President Duterte will only administer the properties of the Kingdom of Jesus Christ and that he will not be the group's new leader.
Di ba merong gustong kumuha ng properties, siyang may responsibility ron to block it, to get it back. But anything about the properties, siyang in charge. Properties lang. Nothing to do with the operations of the Kingdom of Jesus Christ. Sa tingin ko, because he's a lawyer. Kaya siyang ginawang administrator.
Well, in short, yung farm lang, hindi yung flock. Kung shepherds yun. Di ba? Yung farm lang yung jurisdiction ni former President Duterte.
That's a good way to paint it.
Hindi yung flock. Tama, magandang analogy yan, Gretchen. Okay, pag-isipan muna natin, no, ang mga mangyayari. We're gonna pause for a quick break for now. Right after that, we will be speaking live in studio with human rights lawyer, Attorney Chel Diokno, about his plans for 2025. Don't go away.
Welcome back. You're still watching the big story here on One News. Our next guest tonight was among the opposition personalities named by Liberal Party spokesperson and former Senator Laila De Lima as one of their potential candidates in the 2025 midterm elections. And he is joining us tonight on the big story. We have with us on the show human rights lawyer, Attorney Chel Diokno. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you
I guess,
so much for visiting us in person.
Di ba? Kasi sa TikTok ko lang siya napapanood.
Ako rin, actually.
He's more famous on TikTok than you are.
Well, let's set the record straight. Are you not running officially in 2025?
Panahon na ba ngayon na pag-usapan natin yan? You know, I was really surprised that my name was mentioned by Sen. Laila. Of course, I want to thank her for giving me a vote of confidence, but I'm really focused now on working on the problems that our people are facing every day. To me, the time for politics is not yet here. Wala pa naman ang filing ng certificates of candidacy. That comes in October. And in the meantime, I think people are looking for solutions to their day-to-day problems.
Bakit po kaya, kumbaga, nasabi ni Senator Laila? Kasi ang impression po namin, yun ang parang isa sa mga official announcement. What's
because she
further
is the
on?
spokesperson of the Liberal Party.
What I was told was that she went through a very long interview with the FOCAP, and that was one of the questions asked, which apparently was what was focused on by the media after the interview.
Oh, okay.
But you mentioned before 2025, you're now busy, doing things that really
But
will
wait,
help people. Okay,
sorry,
go ahead.
Attorney, just to be 100% clear about it, you have not decided.
Yes, let me put it this way. I am very willing to serve in whatever capacity the people will have me serve. As right now, I'm just a private citizen, and I continue to do what I've been doing for the last 30 years. I handle a lot of human rights cases and do a lot of legal advocacy because I think it's important that we need to bring the law closer to people.
What's part of your discernment process?
It's the realization during the pandemic. During the pandemic, my Facebook page received, in the span of about 7 months, 20,000 legal questions from ordinary people. And when we went over all the questions and answered most of them, we realized that people are not empowered when it comes to the law. There are a lot of things that we can do without getting a lawyer, but we just don't know that it's possible. And when we realized that, we said, there must be ways we can use social media to make people understand that they have the power to change to solve their legal problems.
Actually, that's one of my favorite contents, lawyers making lawyerly content. There's even Congresswoman Migs Nograles. I'm sure you've seen her page also. Ibang klaseng presentation naman ng pagbibigay ng legal advice. But again, just to follow up on Regina's question, so you're not yet sure, but it's not a definite no, right, at this point?
No, definitely not.
So may chance pa?
Of course.
Okay.
Saka siguro, ang masasabi ko lang, lalo na sa mga supporters natin, ay chill lang muna kayo kasi wala pa naman yung
medyo yung linggo po ninyo.
Guys, take a chill.
Nagmi-millennial na. Pero hindi po ba, kasi sinasabi nyo, wala pa naman yung filing, but hindi po ba ang criticism din sa opposition ay nahuli, na late sa decision making? That's why hindi makadiskarte kahit papaano. Isn't that also wise to be able to know early on and to decide on that?
Well, it's very important to understand the landscape and to be able to make sure that when the filing comes, you have a chance of winning. As far as that is concerned, we all think about those things. But if you're asking me, am I going to definitely, throw my hat into the arena, there are so many factors that you have to consider. It's not just the desire to run, but it's also the winnability. It's the kind of support you will get. And that has to be something that you will decide as the time approaches.
Okay, we'll let you off the hook.
Thank you.
That day that former Senator Laila de Lima made that announcement, we were trying to chase her, but who we got to interview that night was former Congressman Teddy Bagilat also. And we were asking him, like, what do you think are the plans? And he just actually mentioned that, Attorney Diokno has been doing really well on social media. Because we were saying,
1 million
parang kulang yung, di ba? Kulang yung
1.2 million TikTok followers.
Was this a conscious effort or was this a separate thing? Meaning, obviously, the last election, social media played such a huge part in the last how many elections, not just here but also abroad. So was that a conscious effort to step up on TikTok? Was it the influence maybe of one of your children? Or was it the 20,000 legal questions that you got on Facebook that prodded you to step up your game?
I think it's a combination of all of that, plus the realization that we are the social media capital of the world. According to some of the studies I've seen, Filipinos go online 10 to 11 hours a day, and half of that time we spend on social media. So if we want to reach our people, that is a very convenient and easy way to reach them. The challenge there is the content. How do you simplify something as abstract as the law? And that's a challenge that all lawyers face in our profession.
How did you attack that issue, that problem, or that hurdle of
I think-
simplifying and laymanizing?
I think it's my background as an educator that helped me. Because when I call my students for recitation and they throw these legal terms at me, I always tell them, explain that to me as if I was not a lawyer. If you can explain it to me in simple terms, then that shows that you understand the concept. And that's what I draw from when I do my TikToks.
Perhaps you can also teach the opposition how to build their TikTok channels, right?
Sure.
Oo.
Grabe naman to.
Hindi, kasi nag-start pa lang. Hindi, but what have been some of your learnings? I mean, diving into this platform, interacting with your followers, specifically on political choices, how people stay long, get convinced, what they consume. What have been your insights on that?
It's a fascinating journey. It has taught me so much about how to communicate online, the kind of language that you need to use, the expressions even that you have on TikTok, and at the same time being authentic and remaining true to yourself and to your values. To me, that's really where you have to learn how to navigate.
You said you keep getting questions on Facebook about legal issues. What are some of the questions that keep coming up?
Like the number one.
Number one, I think, are birth certificates. So many
So
of our
procedural
brothers
things.
and sisters have a mistake in their birth certificate. And so many don't know that they don't need a lawyer in order to correct it. I'm not saying all, but most of those corrections can be done administratively. So we just guide them. We tell them, go to the website of the local civil registry, get the forms, and we can help you fill up the forms, but you can do it yourself. And to me, that's a very empowering process.
Okay. And just in case you do decide to finally throw your hat into the ring and run, I would like to ask Attorney Diokno, since attorney po kayo, ano po yung view ninyo sa Chacha? Do we really need this economic Chacha that's being pushed by both houses? And procedurally speaking, the way that we are doing it now with the resolution of both houses, one resolution of both houses in one house. What are your thoughts on that process?
I think we have to have, if we are going to change the Constitution, it has to be evidence-based, based on what our experts and everyone else in the country believes has to be changed. Now, to me, the best way to do this is to plan it down the line, have a constitutional convention maybe 5 or 10 years down the road, make sure that we have the framework in place so that we can discuss it in a non-political way. The problem with the last few efforts to change the Constitution it has always been a political agenda running behind it, so that the voice of the people is never heard. For example, the People's Initiative that we're seeing today, ang lumabas sa Senate hearings it's just a tiny group of people who had access to a lot of money who began this initiative. It's not really a people's initiative that came from the people. And it's the same thing, I think, with the other forms of Chacha that have been tried.
The evidence supposedly is coming from the business sector, who's asking for a relaxation of economic provisions, saying that we look across ASEAN, we're losing out on FDI because we're so restrictive as an economy. You don't buy that?
I don't buy it because compared to the other countries in the ASEAN region, I think that that is not the factor why direct foreign investment is not coming here. The reasons really have to do with the cost of electricity, with the problems of corruption, with the lack of confidence in the justice system if ever they get into a case, and ease of doing business. All the red tape, the bureaucracy that businesses have to deal with in the country. I've heard this not only from local businessmen, but also from foreign people and companies who want to do business here, but they just don't like the environment.
Do you also buy that this is just an economic charter change?
That's a big question, because once you open the door to a constituent assembly, there's big debate on whether you can change any other part of the Constitution.
What does the law say?
it depends now. Right now, the two houses are working on developing a law. I think a lot will depend on what that law will contain, but ultimately that issue may even reach the Supreme Court.
You mean in terms of the fact that the Constitution does not provide for any constitutional amendments to be done in the way that we are currently doing it now with
Well,
RBH 6, RBH 7?
I think there are two critical issues there. The first one has to do with if Congress agrees and states in the law that this is only limited to lifting the economic restrictions. But one of them, somebody proposes, hindi, buksan na natin yan. Let's talk about lifting term limits. Let's talk about changing to parliamentary. And they agree. I think that issue is going to reach the Supreme Court.
So long story short, it's going to be vulnerable to the usual loopholes in our lawmaking process.
The second
Pag
issue...
nasabay ka, biglang nagiging
Yes.
kakaiba-iba na.
The second issue is the issue of voting jointly or separately. Yun, palagay ko, neither side is going to retreat on their positions as far as that goes. So if push comes to shove, only the court will be able to decide that.
Only the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Attorney, a lot has changed since 2022 under the Marcos administration, with ICC, with the war on drugs, now with charter change. I mean, as somebody just watching all of this, I remember the president recently went to Australia, and Senator Rice protested that this government has not done enough to protect human rights and, in effect, enabling his predecessor. What is your take? Has this government been doing, enough or more than the previous administration to somehow make up for what has been done?
While this government, unlike the previous government, has not directly criticized human rights, they have retained the same apparatus, the same machinery that was existing during the previous administration. And as a member of FLAG, the Free Legal Assistance Group, we continue to receive reports of grave human rights violations. Perhaps the number of extrajudicial killings has gone down, but the cases of enforced disappearances and other kinds of EJKs continue. We continue to get reports. And more recently, what we've been disturbed about are the cases of arrests that are made without warrant. I'm referring to the case of Direct Jade Castro and others who have been the victim of what to us is an abuse of authority.
So collectively speaking, do you think in terms of human rights, since you are, and we have been introducing you as a human rights lawyer, the state of Philippine human rights, have we improved? Are we stagnant? Or have we actually gone down?
Since the last administration really saw a huge dip in terms of respect for human rights. Even the term human rights began to have a derogatory meaning. That hasn't changed. I don't think we've made any improvements since that time. And to us in the human rights community, we really regret the fact that both our military and our police who were already embracing concepts of human rights before 2016 have now pretty much, in many ways, turned their back on it. We feel that that's really a step backward.
But yet, Senator Laila de Lima has been released on bail.
After 7 long years of incarceration, which I think she did not deserve. If you look at the cases that were filed against her, none of them has even prospered. And the fact that she is now has her liberty back will never bring back those 7 years that she was incarcerated. I can understand how difficult it was for her.
But does that speak of the difference in tone or in, I guess, in possibilities with this Marcos government? Because they did treat that differently.
Well, yes, Senator de Lima herself, if I remember correctly, did acknowledge and the fact that the present regime did not intervene in her case. And I think that's really how it should be. We have separation of powers, we have an independent branches of government, and each branch should respect the other. That's one thing that we saw differently in the last administration, where you had the democratic institutions themselves being attacked.
But actually, a few weeks ago, we had Soljan Minardo Guevara here in the studio as well, and I asked him about Senator De Lima's case. Senator De Lima, of course, said she didn't get fair play under Duterte, that the evidence was manufactured against her. I asked that to Soljan Guevara, who at that time was Justice Secretary, and he said, no, he disagrees. He thinks that she did get fair treatment by virtue of the fact that the cases were dismissed nga, that Duterte had ultimately no hand in it. What do you think?
I think that the delay in itself is an indication of how justice can be so twisted and skewed in our country, where even a senator of our republic would have to wait for 7 years before she regains her liberty on the basis of evidence that from the very beginning was highly questionable.
And in your opinion, attorney, should the Philippines rejoin the ICC? Since, bali-balita rin recently, we've all been talking about possible warrant, what should we do, rules of engagement. What's your stand on that?
I think we need a last resort for accountability. The reason why our government decided to join the ICC in the first place was to make sure that when we have very high-level officials whom we cannot easily prosecute here, because they have a lot of influence, because they may have been the ones even to have appointed the members of the court that will judge him or her, we need an out. We need another option where we can be assured of justice from justices who cannot be bribed, who cannot be influenced or intimidated, when we know that in our country, if a president were to be prosecuted here, all of those possibilities are wide open. And it could really happen that justice will not be served in the country.
Very good point. Okay, we've run out of time, unfortunately, for tonight, but we will keep following you on TikTok, to be sure, and also we await word on your final decision on 2025. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
I'm excited to see what the face of the opposition will be.
Yes, human rights lawyer, Attorney Chel Diokno.
All right, before we go, our big pictures tonight, plural. Tonight is about Women's Day. Clearly, the three of us are in pink. And what used to be dominated by male pilots. Our own flag carrier, as well as other airlines, have literally taken female crews to greater heights. Here are some of PAL's and AirAsia's all-female flight crews with women pilots and first officers at the helm. Again, a big salute to women around the world who continue to break barriers, defy stereotypes, and excel in all that you do.
That would have been interesting to be on that all-female crew flight.
I know.
Imagine
I
it
think
makes
I
both
wonder
captains and co-captain
if
are
what you said.
female.
We were joking earlier, and I said, so all the men crew get days off? And
No,
Regina
they
said, no, they're washing the toilets.
They get to clean the lavatories.
Dapat, pag babae ka, tapos nagtrabaho ka sa International Women's Day, may dagdag. Ayun ang women empowerment.
Maganda.
Alam nyo na ipapasa
may
ninyo.
Make it into a law.
On that note, that's it for the big story on this Friday night.
We are One News, all sides, all the time.
Thanks for tuning in. Have a good night and a great weekend.